The story of the U-864 submarine begins at the height of World War II, when the fate of the Third Reich hung in the balance. Germany was losing ground on all fronts, and its allies, particularly Japan, were in dire need of strategic resources. It was under these circumstances that the Nazi command launched a secret operation, codenamed Caesar. Its task was to transfer valuable materials and technologies to Japan that could help the power of the rising sun continue the war against the Allies. The cargo included blueprints for Messerschmitt 260 jet engines, torpedo prototypes, guidance system parts, samples of new alloys, and almost 67 tons of mercury, in weapons production. The task of transporting such a dangerous and valuable cargo was entrusted to the U-864 type IXD submarine, one of the most technologically advanced submarines of its time. U-864 was built at the Agvesa shipyard in Bremen and entered service with the Kriegsmarine in late 1943. Its commander was Captain Lieutenant Rolf Reinhard Marquardt, an officer with experience and dedication to the Reich. The submarine had a crew of 73 people. The boat had an increased cruising range, could cross the Atlantic without refueling, and was equipped with the latest navigation and radio systems. It was because of these characteristics that it was chosen to carry out Operation Caesar. After months of preparation, U-864 was to leave the port of Kiel and sail around the northern coast of Europe, heading for the shores of Japan, hiding in the depths of the ocean. However, immediately after departure, the mission encountered difficulties. During the passage to the coast of Norway, the boat damaged the propeller, presumably due to hitting an underwater reef or the wreckage of another vessel. The command decided to make an emergency stop at the base in Bergen, which postponed the operation for several weeks. At this time, the Allies were actively monitoring the activity of the Kriegsmarine, intercepting radio messages and deciphering data using the Ultra system. It was this interference in the encrypted exchange that helped the Allies find out that U-864 was carrying valuable cargo to the east. Understanding the threat, the British Admiralty sent its submarine to intercept HMS Venturer, under the command of Lieutenant James Lowndes. At this time, U-864 was already on the move again. By early February 1945, she had left Bergen and was moving off the coast of Norway towards the Skagerrak Strait. The commander knew that the enemy could be hunting and moved with extreme caution, alternating dives and surfacing to charge the batteries. But in the area of Fedge Island, off the coast of Bergen, the submarine made a fatal mistake. She sent a radio message about her coordinates, hoping to receive updated instructions. This signal was intercepted by the British. HMS Venturer was already in the same area and began hunting the enemy submarine. This was one of the few cases in the history of naval warfare when one submarine sank another while being submerged. On February 9, 1945, Venturer detected the noise of U-864's propellers and began calculating her course. Lowndes made his decision under conditions of absolute uncertainty. He had to predict the target's movements and fire the torpedoes blindly. He decided to use a sequential salvo, 4 torpedoes at intervals of several seconds. The tactic was successful. One of the torpedoes hit the hull of U-864, causing a devastating explosion. The submarine sank along with its crew and cargo. For many years, this incident was known only from archives, and no one knew exactly where U-864 rested. Only almost 60 years later, a group of Norwegian researchers, conducting a survey of the seabed near the island of Fedge, came across the wreckage. Inside were mercury containers, twisted hull elements, and remains of equipment. This discovery aroused unprecedented interest from both military historians and environmentalists. The mercury containers began to leak, which posed a threat to marine fauna and the fishing industry in the region. Thus began a new chapter of history, no longer military, but ecological. But the submarine operation Caesar itself, despite its failure, remains unique in its purpose and drama. It was an attempt by the Reich to extend a helping hand to an ally, which failed in the depths of the North Sea. For almost 6 decades, the bottom of the North Sea remained silent. The story of U-864 remained just one of dozens of underwater tragedies of the Second World War. No one knew exactly where the submarine was, which sank under such unusual circumstances, as a result of the only underwater duel in history. Even the coordinates given in the British reports were too approximate. Only in the early 2000s did interest in this case flare up again, thanks to both technical progress and growing concerns about possible environmental pollution. In 2003, the Norwegian Coastal Administration Kystverket, together with the Norwegian Navy, began to survey the seabed near the island of Fedge. The goal of the operation was not to find the sunken German submarine, but to study possible objects interfering with safe navigation. However, using side sonar and underwater drones, the researchers came across an anomaly, a long metal structure, partially submerged in the sandy bottom and covered in layers of silt and marine life. At first, it was not certain that this was the U-864. However, the shape of the structure, the presence of internal compartments, and then the discovered elements of German assembly left no doubt. This was the submarine. Additional examination confirmed the submarine lies at a depth of about 150 meters, split into 2 main parts. Radioactive sensors recorded unusual indicators in the area of the bow compartment, where the containers with mercury were located. According to preliminary data, almost 1,800 canisters, each weighing about 35 kilograms, were buried along with the crew. Some of them were damaged. Elevated levels of mercury were recorded in water samples taken near the wreckage. This immediately raised concerns among environmentalists. Fishing companies operating in the Bergen area began to sound the alarm. The fish could be contaminated, which meant there was a health risk for consumers across Europe. Local authorities, scientists, and environmentalists began to demand urgent action. However, the question was not simple: how to handle a nearly intact underwater burial site that combined military history, toxic cargo, and human remains. Intervention could be dangerous. Any careless action could cause a large-scale mercury leak, which would have a catastrophic impact on the ecosystem. On the other hand, leaving the situation untreated meant the risk of ongoing contamination, albeit at a slower pace. While the debate continued, experts began to carefully map the wreckage. Underwater robots were used, capable of not only recording images, but also taking samples. Thanks to these studies, it became clear the mercury containers were installed in special compartments, some of which survived, while others were destroyed by the explosion of the HMS Venturer torpedo. The wreckage is scattered over an area of about 200 meters. Some elements, such as fuel tanks, internal beams, and even personal belongings of the crew, have been identified. Particularly impressive was the bronze ship's bell found at depth with the boat's number stamped on it, U-864. Amid the interest from the media and historians, debates began at the international level. Germany officially declared that the site of the U-864 wreck should be considered a military grave. The UK supported the proposal to keep the boat intact, provided that an environmental threat was prevented. Norway, however, found itself in a difficult situation. It had to find a way to calm the wave of public discontent and make a decision that would take into account both the memory of the fallen and the safety of the marine environment. Meanwhile, local fishermen reported strange changes in their catches. Some claimed that the fish had changed their migration route, others that the number of sick individuals had increased. These statements were not always scientifically proven, but they created pressure on the authorities. The problem became not only ecological and historical, but also political. The question of what to do with U-864 divided the public. Despite concerns, In 2006, the Norwegian authorities decided to begin the active phase of the project to neutralize the threat. It was decided that mercury or debris would not be removed from U-864, but an attempt would be made to isolate the submarine from the outside environment. The plan included the construction of a giant sarcophagus made of concrete and steel, which was supposed to completely cover the submarine and prevent any leaks. This project was supposed to be the first of its kind. No country had previously faced the need to bury a military facility with such risks underwater. The decision to build an underwater sarcophagus over the remains of U-864 caused a wave of mixed reactions in society. Some believed that this was the best way to prevent mercury leakage, while others argued that without removing the containers, the submarine would sooner or later begin to deteriorate. Nevertheless, by 2009, the Norwegian authorities launched a project to isolate the site, which went down in history as one of the most ambitious environmental projects in Europe. The project was supervised by the Norwegian Coastal Administration in cooperation with the Ministry of the Environment and the Armed Forces. The plan included the creation of a concrete cap that would completely cover the wreckage of the submarine, as well as leveling and strengthening the seabed. The main task was to prevent further destruction of the containers with mercury and to exclude its release into the aquatic environment. Experts from several countries were involved in the calculations, including engineers from Germany and Great Britain. Innovative marine construction technologies were used. Instead of traditional concrete, special mixtures with increased resistance to corrosion and hydraulic pressure were used. First, the bottom around the wreckage was reinforced with steel piles and geotextile mats. Then the process of laying a multi-layer coating began, first a layer of crushed stone, then concrete reinforced with polymer elements. The entire process took more than a year. The work was complicated by strong currents, low water temperatures and limited visibility at a depth of 150 meters. The process was controlled remotely using underwater robots, each of which performed strictly specified functions, from scanning the position of the wreckage to spot pouring of concrete mass. Interesting finds were recorded during the construction process. The robot's cameras captured how some of the wreckage began to collapse from time and pressure. In one of the sections, it was possible to discern the remains of the crew's personal belongings, helmets, boots, even brochures in German, miraculously surviving in sealed compartments. These finds were later studied and documented, but they were not raised to the surface, as this would have violated the submarine's status as a military burial site. By 2011, the main work on the sarcophagus was completed. The wreckage of U-864 was buried under a multi-meter layer of concrete, reinforced with a steel mesh. The total cost of the project was about 350 million Norwegian kroner. It became the largest marine operation in the history of Norway related to environmental safety. Since then, specialists have regularly monitored the condition of the sarcophagus using sensors and periodic underwater inspections. According to reports, the mercury level in the water has stabilized, not exceeding the permissible limits. But the questions did not disappear. Some scientists insisted that over time, the concrete could develop microcracks, especially if the water temperature changes or the sea level rises. They suggested returning to the idea of removing the mercury containers while it is still possible to carry out the operation without catastrophic consequences. However, such proposals caused political and legal tensions. Germany, as the country whose submarine lies underwater, demanded that international agreements on the protection of war graves be observed. Norway, for its part, tried to prevent the conflict from escalating. At the same time, the topic of U-864 began to attract interest from the general public. Lectures on the unusual history of submarine warfare and the environmental consequences of World War II began to be held in schools and universities. A temporary exhibition dedicated to U-864 appeared in Bergen, not far from the site of the submarine sinking. It displayed models of the submarine, photographs from the scene of the operation, fragments of the sailors' memories, as well as interactive stands, where visitors could follow the construction of the sarcophagus in real time. The exhibition was popular, especially among young people, and there were even plans to transform it into a permanent museum. The operation to isolate U-864 became an example of how military tragedies of the past continue to influence our present. It's not just debris lying on the seabed. It's tens of tons of toxic metal that could harm hundreds of thousands of people if left unchecked. But it's also a memorial to the 73 sailors who died, whose bodies are still inside the boat. Balancing respect for the dead and concern for the living has proven to be the project's central ethical dilemma. Today, more than 10 years after the operation was completed, the sarcophagus remains under constant surveillance. Fishing and navigation bans are in effect around it, and data from the sensors is transmitted to the Central Monitoring Center in Oslo. So far, the system is working effectively, but experts do not rule out that in a few decades, the structure will have to be further strengthened. Thus, the story of U-864 is not over. This is not just a page from a history textbook. It is a living, ongoing history where ecology, technology, memory and politics are intertwined into one ball. And perhaps in the future, new technologies will allow us to return to this place with even more reliable solutions. But for now, the sarcophagus is silent, like the entire sea around it. Since the discovery of the wreckage of U-864 and the first leaks of information about its cargo, questions have increasingly arisen in society. Why was this submarine heading to Japan at the very end of World War II? Why was so little known about its route? And what exactly was on board? Scattered documents, testimonies, and fragmentary memories of specialists have allowed researchers to reconstruct the picture of one of the most mysterious missions of the Nazi fleet, Operation Caesar. U-864 was not an ordinary combat boat. It was a courier for Nazi Germany, carrying out a secret mission to deliver strategically important cargo to Japan. Contact was maintained between the Axis countries until the last months of the war, and Japan desperately needed high technology that could help in the fight against the United States. Germany, in the conditions of collapse on the Eastern Front, was looking for ways to strengthen its allies and maintain its influence. According to declassified archives, U-864 was carrying not only 67 tons of metallic mercury, but also jet engine blueprints, aircraft parts, high-precision optical instruments, and to Japanese engineers who were supposed to transfer knowledge and pick up samples of equipment. Of particular interest was the fact that the cargo could have included elements of an unfinished project for a German rocket-powered aircraft, a possible precursor to future space developments. This would have given Japan an advantage in the air if the cargo had reached its destination. Operation Caesar was kept in the strictest confidence. Even in the German command, only a select few knew about it. The crew of U-864 was carefully selected, and Captain Rolfreimar Wolfram had a reputation as a reliable and efficient officer. Before sailing, the boat was modernized in keel, was equipped with a snorkel and an additional cooling system, all in order to pass the entire Atlantic and Indian Ocean without being detected. However, when setting off, things did not go according to plan. U-864 damaged a propeller due to a navigational error and was forced to stop for repairs in Bergen. It was here that the information leak probably occurred. The Allies intercepted radio communications and sent the British submarine HMS Venturer to intercept it. It was a rare case in history when one submarine sank another while underwater, and it happened exactly when U-864 left the Norwegian fjord. It is surprising that such a large-scale operation did not make it into school textbooks. It was not talked about for a long time, and documents concerning the cargo were classified for decades. Even after the discovery of the wreckage, Norwegian authorities were cautious about commenting on what exactly was on board. It was only in 2006 that it became known that we are talking about 1,857 steel containers of mercury. But some experts believe that this is only a small part of the cargo. Conspiracy theories began to appear in the media and on the internet. Some suggested that the submarine was transporting biological weapons samples or even radioactive materials. These rumors were encouraged by the silence of official structures and repeated denials of access to archives. Another hypothesis concerned the so-called Japanese Plan B. Allegedly, Germany was trying to transfer cruise missile technology to the Allies that could be used against the US coast. The situation was fueled by the interest of international military historians. In 2015, a monograph was published in Germany, which, based on interviews with former Abwehr and Kriegsmarine employees, concluded that U-864 was part of a global plan to strengthen Japan in the event of the Reich's surrender. This mission was supposed to be a transition of power from one Axis country to another, that everything ended in an instant, 4 torpedoes and an explosion that destroyed not only the submarine, but also the entire delivery route. It is also important that the explosion scattered the containers for tens of meters. This means that part of the cargo could not be identified. Some researchers are convinced that the most sensitive elements could have been carried to the bottom and still not found. This gives grounds for new expeditions, scientific debates, and speculations in the media. The story of U-864 is not just a story about the death of a submarine. It is an attempt to reconstruct one of the last spurts of Nazi Germany, when hope still remained, despite the almost guaranteed defeat. This is a story about how technology, politics, and secret alliances intersect at the bottom of the Cold Sea. And although we may never know some of the information, U-864 will forever remain a symbol of the unsaid and hidden pages of the Second World War. After the wreckage of U-864 was discovered off the coast of the Norwegian island of Fedge in 2003, authorities were faced with difficult questions: what to do with a unique but extremely dangerous artifact of World War II. The submarine, lying at a depth of about 150 meters, has been slowly leaking for more than half a century, and its contents of 67 tons of metallic mercury are gradually seeping into the seawater. This circumstance has turned the sunken ship from a historical site into an environmental threat. Scientific research has shown that between 3 and 4 kilograms of mercury enter the water every year. It may seem like a small amount, but it is enough to cause serious harm to the ecosystem. Marine organisms accumulate the toxic metal, which can subsequently affect the food chain, including humans. Residents of coastal communities have already begun to voice concerns. Fish and seafood caught in the region may be hazardous to health. Public opinion in Norway is divided. On the one hand, environmentalists and local fishermen insist that the submarine must be urgently raised and disposed of. On the other hand, underwater operations specialists warn that intervention could trigger a leak of a much larger volume of mercury. The submarine's hull is fragile, damaged by the explosion of the HMS Venturer torpedoes, and the mercury containers are scattered and partially destroyed. Any carelessness could lead to an environmental disaster. The Norwegian government has been discussing possible action scenarios for several years. One of them is to raise the wreckage. This would require an extremely complex and expensive operation involving special vessels, robotic manipulators, and sealed cameras. The second option is to leave everything as is, installing monitoring equipment above the submarine. But this path does not solve the problem. It only postpones it. Mercury continues to leak, albeit slowly. In 2009, a third scenario was proposed: burial. A special underwater structure was supposed to cover the wreck site, completely isolating it from the environment. In 2017, preparatory work began. The project was criticized. It was believed that it did not guarantee complete safety and only masked the threat. However, by 2020, the bulk of the work was completed. More than 100,000 tons of stone and sand were laid over U-864, creating a protective barrier. Nevertheless, monitoring continues. Scientists record mercury concentrations in the water, monitor the condition of the coating, and conduct regular studies of marine flora and fauna. International organizations are expressing concern and demanding full transparency. Scientific communities compare the situation with other underwater threats, including nuclear ones, and consider U-864 one of the largest non-nuclear environmental problems in Europe. In addition to the environmental aspect, there is a political issue. Germany is reluctant to comment on the situation, citing Norway's sovereignty and the passage of time. Japan avoids making any statements, while the Norwegians themselves perceive U-864 as an unpleasant legacy of the past, which, however, cannot be ignored. Some believe that the wreckage of the submarine should become a museum or a memorial, while others believe that it should be forgotten as soon as possible. Over time, the situation began to change in the cultural sphere. Documentaries, books, and even theatre productions dedicated to U-864 appeared. Artists and photographers from Norway, Germany, and the UK began creating installations on the theme of the sunken danger. The submarine became a metaphor, a symbol of how the shadows of the past continue to affect the present, and how unfinished business from World War II can surface decades later as a very real threat. Some researchers argue that there may be more than just mercury hidden under the layer of rocks. Allegedly, according to unconfirmed information, among the scattered containers there may be samples of experimental weapons or even the remains of the Japanese engineers who accompanied the cargo. But access to these areas is now impossible, at least in the foreseeable future. The story of U-864, the rare case of a military operation from World War II having an impact on international politics and ecology in the 21st century. Its mission failed, but the consequences continue to unfold decades later. Perhaps in 50 years, someone will once again raise the question, what is actually lying on the seabed off the coast of Norway? And why do we still not know the whole truth? U-864 is not just a submarine. It is a reminder of how dangerous the cargo of the past can be if it is not fully studied. And until the last container is raised, until the last drop of mercury ceases to threaten the sea, its story will remain an unclosed page in the annals of World War II.